Let's talk about using the EaganMatrix module as an audio processor. This is probably one of the simplest things you can do with a module. I have the module here connected with the outputs to my mixer module. We'll use a Euclidean circles rhythmic gate processor basically that will feed different patterns to a quad drum voice module. Here I have this set to 4 different drum sounds. When I play that drum module, I'm going to send the stereo outputs of that into the audio inputs of my EaganMatrix module. And that's all I need to do for basic audio processing. I also have a couple other things connected here, but they don't really affect the audio processing. I'm running the editor through USB. I also have an Arturia BeatStep Pro connected into the MIDI in case I want to use my controllers on the BeatStep, but I'm going to use the front panel to do that in this video. There are a number of different presets in the processor category. Let's bring up the editor here. Now you don't need to use the editor to use the module at all. You will need the editor if you want to download firmware to the module, and a couple other reasons to use the editor. Number one, select presets and put those presets into user positions easily. You can do that all on the module if you want to, but if you want to set yourself up beforehand quickly, an easy way to do that is to use the editor. Now the editor has a new look to it. So you'll notice there's a new preset selection mechanism for those of you who know the editor. That's a lot easier to use than in the past. Now you can select from one of the previous categories, say strings, winds, vocals, a few have been renamed, and then you can select a filtering subtype. Say I want to have strings and all the strings that have a bowed sound. And I'll start seeing a list then that will be sub-filtered as I make more selections. So let's say I want strings that are bowed that have an acoustic-like sound. And again, more filtering will be applied, and then you can simply select one and it will be loaded, and you can go from there. You can also select what EaganMatrix facilities might be used. If you're interested in programming, for example, and you want to know which of these sounds might, for example, use a Harman. You can also select the setting. These have to do with channel 1 presets, mono interval presets, presets that use split voices, presets that use rounding. Most of these do not really apply to the EaganMatrix module, so you'll really be more interested in the previous categories. But the most interesting thing about this new preset selection process is you can now type a string in. So if I know I want to bring up the basic audio through preset, I can just type audio and it will automatically show me all the presets that have audio in it, and I'll select my audio through, and that's the preset we want to talk about in this video. It is perhaps the simplest of all the presets, but in terms of the EaganMatrix module, one of the more useful. Now let's look at this other option. We were looking at the system library display. If I look at the EaganMatrix module display, I'll see the EaganMatrix. And I'm not interested in talking about EaganMatrix programming so much in this video, but it would be nice for you to understand the basics of how this EaganMatrix works. And you can see this is the preset for audio through. You have to look at it twice to see that there's anything going on at all. So what is going on in this audio through preset? Well, the EaganMatrix is based on an old analog synth that allowed you with patch points to connect up inputs to outputs. In our case here, sources to destinations, and instead of physical patches, I'm going to use either constants or formulas to do my patching. And when I put a constant, as I have in this case, on the intersection between the source and the destination, it's going to route that input source to the output destination. A 1 in the EaganMatrix normally means unity. In other words, the full amount that I'm sending in, I'm going to send that right out to the stereo left and stereo right channels without either attenuating it or providing any additional amplification. Of course, there is a bass attenuation that you can set on your module. Just press the octave plus and octave minus buttons together to get into the menu system, and if it's not showing you this dB value, use the octave plus or minus buttons to scroll to that, and that's your base attenuation setting. Here it's set to minus 0 dB, the maximum value, but if things are too hot, you can set that lower, and that's your base master attenuation. If you have the editor up, you'll notice in the top left-hand corner, as I turn this, it'll change. So as I change values on the module, they'll also change in the editor, and vice versa. If I change this in the editor, it'll change it on the module. So I'll keep it back at my 0 dB level. Now, after attenuation, there's one more parameter you need to look at in the menu system, and that's audio in. This has to be set greater than 0 for you to do any audio processing. For the most part, you'll want to set this to 64 or greater. Most of the presets that turn on audio processing by default set it greater than that. Obviously, you can play around with it to get it to the right level that you want for the signal that you're sending in. In this case, I'm only really interested in two of the sources, my audio left and audio right channels. You can see they're both specified as unity input, so whatever I'm sending in my two audio connections, the unity value of that is being sent out to the stereo left and stereo right outputs. That's pretty much how all the sources to destinations work in the EaganMatrix, but in this case it's pretty simple to see and understand. The additional thing we need to realize, when I send audio to the SL/SR channels, what's called the master section is also going to be applied. That does a number of different things. First, it applies recirculation, reverb, echo, if it's set. Second, it will apply convolution if set. Convolution is not applying a space response like a church or some small room. It's applying a convolution body. This is more something that will change the timbre of the sound than location of the sound. Also, the newer tilt EQ function is applied, again, if turned on. We'll talk a little bit about that. And finally, though I don't have it down on the sheet here, if you send a signal in that's past unity, that's too hot, a saturation algorithm will be applied, and that can be useful to do things like if you're sending, say, a sine wave that's way too hot, instead of it just being totally clipped, the saturation effect will apply a little wave shaping, and that can be a much nicer sound for you than just clipping. Saturation we'll leave for another time to talk more about, but let's say a few more words about Recirculator, Convolution, and Tilt EQ. The default Recirculator is a bass reverb. There are 6 additional Recirculator settings which you can set. These have to be set in the editor. You can't set them on the front panel on the module or through a CC. A preset has to be configured in one of these to begin with. But once it's configured, you can change parameters of the Recirculator on the front panel or through CCs or through the editor. So there's a default reverb, there's a modulated delay, a swept echo, an analog echo, and 2 types of digital echoes, one with low-pass filtering and the other with high-pass filtering. We'll talk about just the bass reverb in this video. Each one of these recirculators have 5 different parameters that can be set that have different meanings depending upon which type of reverb or echo you're using. The first 3 of them, in the reverb case, diffuse, darkness, and damping, cannot be set on the module itself. Those can only be set in the editor or through CCs if you have a controller that you can program. Frankly, these are usually less commonly used as they change the sound, in most cases, less than changing the last 2 parameters, which you can change both on the module and in the editor. The first one is either the decay time of the reverb. Others just use the term time that has a similar meaning. And the second parameter that can be changed is the mix, right? Your wet-dry percentage of the recirculator being applied. So if you want to use the recirculator from the module, If you're in the preset mode, press octave plus and octave minus, and with the octave plus or minus keys, scroll till you get to the effect level or effect time. Effect L, EFL, that corresponds to our mix on the editor, and effect T corresponds to either the decay or the time in the editor. And if you want to change these in real time, simply scroll to these and make your changes as you need to. Press the 2 octave buttons again and you're back to preset display mode. So there's our recirculator. It won't have any effect, of course, if the mix is set to 0, if the mix is set to dry. So there's our mix set to 0. We're set totally dry here. If I want to bring that in on a sound, I'll turn that up. Next we have EQ. EQ also can be set on the module. The EQ function basically applies 2 shelving filters that you can change the tilt and frequency content of, plus your wet to dry mix ratio. If I go past the effect parameters on the module, I'll get to the EQ parameters. So EQT sets the balance between the 2 shelving filters that are used to do the EQ processing. The further you set this, the sharper the slope or tilt will be on these filters, so you can create mild EQ sounds to rather severe EQ changes. The EQF, EQ frequency parameter, defines the crossover point between the 2 shelving filters. And finally, the EQL, EQ level, or EQ mix, defines the wet-dry percentage of how much of this EQ is being applied to the input. So that's our EQ. That's a relatively new feature. Now we have convolution. Convolution can't be directly controlled through the EaganMatrix module, but you can apply convolution parameters to macro controls and use the macro controllers to change your convolution. Here you can see the different selections of convolutions that are available: fiber, metal, wood, snap, guitar, auto harp 2, auto harp, waterphone 2, waterphone. To be honest, I pay less attention to what the names of these things are and more attention to what they actually sound like when I use them. Now, convolution you can set to 4 different values, and you can then program them to interpolate between those values. So if I want to set a program that uses all 4 of these values, I can set a control that moves through the full range there, and it will interpolate through all these values. If I only want to set that to interpolate between only 2 of them, or even within 1, I can. Best way to explain this is to just show it to you, which we'll do a little bit down the road. I've created a preset that applies convolution, and it has 2 controls. One that will control how much of a mix of convolution is output, and the other controls where you are in the interpolation between all these parameters. Okay, so that's it, and here is the schematic of what we'll be demonstrating in terms of the rhythmic processor driving a drum module, feeding its output into the audio inputs of the EaganMatrix module, and now applying my audio through preset to that. Let's turn on my little sequence that I have going here. Let me turn down the attenuation a bit. Here I'm totally dry, so I will go to my effect level. I've set the effect time a little bit past halfway. These numbers will represent MIDI values, 0 to 127. And now let me bring up the reverb. I'll go back to the effect level. I'll bring up the reverb. You can kind of hear it's starting to kick in. I can really bring that in a lot. I can change the time around if I bring that down a bit. I'll make it a little less reverby, or I can bring it up. And this will be applied with this audio through preset to any sound that you send into the module. Okay, let's go to the EQ now. I'll navigate to the EQ level. EQ has no effect if it's set to 0, so I'm going to turn that up. I'll turn it up high so we can really hear what's going on here. And now I'll set a tilt. If tilt is set in the middle, these are MIDI numbers, 0 to 127, so 63, 64 will be around in the middle. If I set tilt in the middle, my changes will be less obvious than if I set that tilt, that slope, way off center. So I'm going to set that way low, and you can hear already when I set that, it drastically changes the sound. And I can also play with the frequency, change that around, and that will change how my EQ changes when I go back to the slope. You get the idea. Pretty useful. This EQ function is relatively new to the EaganMatrix, but on the EaganMatrix module you can see it's really, really useful. Okay, let's now go to convolution. As I said before, convolution cannot be directly applied on the EaganMatrix module. So what I've done is created another preset. In this preset, in this master section, programmed in some convolution. This video is not about EaganMatrix programming. I have plenty of other videos that discuss how to do this. For now, the thing to center on is I've added a body control, which is going to change where I am in the 4 convolution types that I've applied on this preset. And you can see I've chosen the wood, metal, guitar, and Waterphone 1 convolutions that I'm going to basically scroll and interpolate through with my controls. So my first control is going to change which body I'm moving through. The second control is going to change the amount of convolution I'm applying. You can also program in Recirculator parameters, and I basically just added 2 Recirculator parameters, the time and mix parameters. I added them as controllers so I don't have to go back and forth in my module. I can just go to the macro controller buttons and quickly push one of those to change any one of these 4 parameters I programmed. We can make all of these presets available to anybody who's interested in them. Well, let's see what happens now when I start playing around with these different convolutions. Bring back our pattern. We'll go to convolution mix. I'll turn that up. You can hear the second I turn that up, you can hear convolution being applied. It's at a fixed point now. I'm not moving through the convolutions at this point. But even bringing that one convolution, hear the base convolution at 0. So this would be the wood convolution at the bottom value. If I start changing through the convolutions, you'll hear a lot more change. I'll turn up the level, and now I will start moving through the convolutions. You can really get some nice changes there. And then as I start changing with the patterns, I think you get the idea. There's a lot you can do with just the base audio processing on the EaganMatrix module. I haven't even talked about the other options that we have available. Let's just take a look at some of them. But let me go back and let's look at the processor category. You can see there's quite a number of different options here, from ambient delays to echoes, chorus effects. One of the processors takes the input and applies mod-man granular processing to it. There's FDN processing. There's flanger, car plus strong effect. Here the kinetic model is being applied to your input. A Leslie speaker kind of application. Previous versions of the EaganMatrix only had 3 processor options. Now there's a lot more, and more will be added, I'm sure, on every new release. Now, of course, some of these are going to drastically change the input sound. You can play around, just pick one, I don't know, say chorus 1, apply your sound, and here I've got a little bit of chorusing going on in my sound. The other main reason you may want to bring the editor up is when you select a preset. There's plenty of help on a lot of them that tells you what does that preset do, how it's programmed a little bit, but more importantly, what all the controls are used for in that preset. So you know what each one of your buttons on your module is going to do when you load up that processor sound, though that applies to any preset you may load. So that's it. There's the basics of using the module for analog audio processing. A lot more that can be done here. I've only scratched the surface, but I think it gives you a little bit of an idea of how you can use this as not just a synth, but also a general purpose audio processor.